Where there is a true and total breakdown of law and order, where citizens' most basic rights have been violated, then the federal government can and should send the National Guard to restore order and secure the peace without having to wait for the approval of some governor that thinks it's politically incorrect to call them in. When governors refuse to protect their people, we need to bring in what's necessary anyway. We have to go beyond the governor.
That was former President Donald Trump reading words to a friendly audience on Tuesday, the America First conference in Washington, D.C. During the speech, he was talking about his future run for president. It was Trump's first trip back to the nation's capital in over a year and a half, and his visit came just one day before the news broke that the Department of Justice is in fact investigating his actions as part of a wider scope into the events of January the 6th. Joining us now to break it all down, former federal prosecutor and MSNBC legal analyst Glenn Kirshner. I was a little tongue-in-cheek there, but it really was like just reading the words. I mean, he was looking like at the thing really, really closely. But maybe that's a good thing, Glenn. First, NBC News is reporting that former acting chief of staff Mick Mulvaney, the latest Trump official, he's going to meet with the January 6th committee today. And it feels like there's been some movement over the past couple of weeks. What can someone like him shed light on, even if he was already gone from the administration when the insurrection actually happened, Glenn?
For Donald Trump, perhaps he should spend less time running for president and more time running out to find a defense attorney who might still be willing to represent him. And, you know, Mick Mulvaney is sort of the latest in what seems to be a growing list of former high government officials who are now testifying, whether to the J6 committee or to the federal grand jury, about the conduct of Donald Trump. Now, Mick Mulvaney, recall, was the official who, when Donald Trump got caught red-handed trying to leverage congressional funds in exchange for dirty political favor from President Zelensky, you know, Mick Mulvaney said, look, we do it all the time. Get over it. So I say that because I don't expect the committee will ask Mick Mulvaney about what seemed to be a conspiracy to bribe and extort President Zelensky. I'm hoping the Department of Justice is still investigating that. But a guy like Mick Mulvaney, quite frankly, you know, if I'm a prosecutor or an investigator and I'm listening to his testimony, I'm going to want 3 forms of corroboration support before I'm willing to believe a Mick Mulvaney. But listen, he was in the room. He can bring some important information about how Donald Trump operates. And let's hope that he is forthcoming, truthful, and accurate with the J6 committee.
Maybe he was there one of the other times ketchup was dripping down the wall and he can validate that for us. Just kidding. Maybe I'm not kidding. Maybe that's actually true. One of the things that I was also thinking about as we see the January 6th committee continue their work, even though Congress is set to go on recess, it's happening all at the same time that Donald Trump is now back out here, right? As I mentioned, he's here in Washington, D.C., giving speeches, alluding to the fact that he's going to be running again. But he's also been very consistent on a couple of different points, that he doesn't think that insurrectionists did anything wrong, that he doesn't think they should be charged and convicted of crimes, that he may even potentially pardon people who were involved in the attack on the Capitol. Is that something the DOJ takes into consideration? Is there anything that Trump says now or on the campaign trail potentially, if he does run in 2024, that could come back to bite him because the DOJ is investigating him for what happened on January 6th?
Zerlina, Donald Trump's every statement is a potential admission by a party opponent, something that could be introduced against him at trial when and if he is ultimately indicted and prosecuted. And I have to tell you, the people who were duped the first time on January 6th, they were lied to, they were deceived by Donald Trump into falsely believing their vote had been stolen and that they had to go to the Capitol and fight like hell or they wouldn't have a country anymore. And then he, you know, pointed them in the direction of the Capitol and said, now go stop the steal. And they did. They're being prosecuted. They're being convicted. They're being imprisoned. And many of them de facto committed the crime of insurrection, even though those aren't necessarily the charges that they're pleading guilty to or being convicted of. And what is Donald Trump doing? He's giving them aid and comfort. You know, it's also against the law not only to launch an insurrection or a rebellion, but to give aid and comfort to insurrectionists. So I am sure the Department of Justice is paying close attention to every word Donald Trump utters, and some of it, I predict, will be introduced in a court of law at a future prosecution.
One of the other things I think a lot about, Glenn, as you lay that out very methodically and comprehensively, is the fact that we're talking about Donald Trump here. He's the, like, break everything type of person. So is any of that sort of methodical investigation going to matter when we're talking about Donald Trump, who tried to do a coup? And is the Department of Justice maybe feeling more urgency in terms of the timing of when to charge? Because, you know, he's a little bit of a loose cannon.
I think they are feeling a sense of urgency. Now, the party line from the Department of Justice will be, we tune all of that out. We never make prosecutorial decisions based on, for example, political election cycles. And I understand all of that. But here's the problem. Insurrectionists are prohibited by the 14th Amendment from serving again in federal office. And that's precisely what Donald Trump is doing. So I'm hoping the Department of Justice is also keeping its eye on the political clock, if only to enforce that prohibition from having insurrectionists serve in federal office in the future.
Really important point to keep in mind there. Glenn Kirschner, thank you so much for joining us always and helping us get smarter on these issues. Please stay safe.
Hi, I'm Zerlina Maxwell. Thanks for checking out our channel on YouTube. You can see more from Zerlina by clicking any of the videos on this screen, and make sure you subscribe below to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. Thanks for watching.